Bodo Rosenhahn is a colleague here in Hanover, computer scientist. He is working on vision scene analysis. Had an ESC grant on this topic and is now involved in several interesting projects also with respect to personalized medicine. And Bodo, we are very much looking forward to your talk. Good. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yes, welcome to my presentation. My name is Bodo Rosenhahn from the L3S and the Institute for Information Processing here in Hanover. And as I would like to thank the organizers, Niloy and Mega, for organizing this event and the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of our research we are involved in. And I have a quite general title. It's about multi-object tracking. And tracking means to follow something. And since we can follow many things on different levels, you can apply it to tracking cells, microorganisms like algae, or even humans or people in surveillance scenarios. And these are a couple of examples where we are involved in. So we are participating in a couple of challenges like the MOT challenge or the cell tracking challenge. And applications are that you have, for instance, a surveillance scenario, you have a detector for people, and you're interested which people are moving in which direction. This can be interesting for understanding, for instance, traffic scenarios or behavior, but also for understanding the social behavior of groups. We also apply these techniques for sports analysis. So if you have team sports like soccer or basketball, you can use this to analyze the attacking and defending scenarios and the relation of the players to each other with respect to the ball. Or you can apply this in the medical domain, like tracking beads in tissue, for instance, to see how, for instance, different areas are activated. Or here in this scenario, it's an example on tracking cell lines. You have some cells and they are growing, and then they are growing more and more, and then they replicate. So you want to understand how they are replication and how much and how often and what kind of cell line do they produce. The paradigm we follow here is called tracking by detection, which means we have two steps involved. One is to detect the objects in the images on the scene, and the other part is to link these tracks. And traditionally, these are kept separately. There are now some more modern approaches which link these approaches, but I will mainly talk about the aspect of track linking here. And we will talk about basically graph optimization or max flow optimization in graphs to handle this problem. And graph optimization is something which is, I think, pretty important and pretty interesting for many domains, because there are many settings we can express in terms of graphs. So you can consider social media graphs, for instance, people interacting on social media graphs. You can consider pathway of omics data and represent them as path, or you can try to analyze cohorts of patients with respect to their relations and connectivity and express this as a graph. So formulating data and analyzing data in terms of graphs can be pretty powerful, and that's why we got interested in a specific graph-based optimization algorithm to solve these challenges. And many people know me from works on human motion capturing, 3D reconstruction, but indeed this is also a topic which is quite old in our institute. And this was one of the first projects I was involved in. It was a DFG project together with Karlsruhe. And they were developing a holographic imaging device to analyze or explore, let's say, scenes underwater. It was about tracking algae in the domain of biofouling. So algae are moving towards surfaces. They want to settle down and replicate there. And then you have carpets of algae, and this can be quite problematic if this happens in cooling devices of power plants, or if this is on the hull of a larger ship. And this is the reason, for instance, why on ships very often toxic colors are used. But for one ship, you need around 10,000 liters of toxic color. So you really try to use other surfaces like nanostructured surfaces which prevent settlement of these algae. So we basically got recordings of such algae, and they were just recordings of particles in 3D. And our job was to link these 3D positions of these particles to generate such trajectories, and then to analyze the motion patterns of these trajectories and to classify them. And here we followed an approach based on so-called hidden Markov models. The main challenge at this time was to establish the pairwise matching across these images. And the problem is that you can have particles entering a scene and particles leaving a scene, which means if you simply apply a graph matching on, for instance, these two images, you get an assignment which is not correct. So you would like to have another kind of assignment which tells you that particles are leaving and others are entering, and you want to handle this. And there are other problems as well, like how to handle double detections in these image detection frameworks where you have multiple bounding boxes around people or cars. You have missing detections, you have occlusions, self-occlusions, and so on. So the main challenge is how to deal with these challenges to reach consistency across all these different frames we would like to track objects. We are also working in the domain of detection, and not just people detection, also cell detection. So this is one example frame from a cooperation with the ETEM, where we get images of cells and we understand where are the cells, how large they are, and then we also analyze the patterns of these cells. But I will not talk about this today. I would really like to talk about this graph optimization problems of these multiple frames we have. And the paradigm we follow is called linear programming. And interestingly, it's a very powerful concept, but it's not very well known nowadays because most people focus on neural networks and machine learning, but it's also a part of machine learning. And interesting, it allows you not just something like a differential optimization of a problem, which happens in neural networks when you train them, it allows you to perform a global optimization. And there's an interesting quote of a researcher in 1980, and he said that if you take all the computational effort in the world and you sum up where this computation was wasted on, then one of the typical outcomes would be probably linear programming. So this is a framework that is frequently used for physical simulation and for other tasks. I would now disagree with that quote because I would say most of the energy in computation is wasted into Bitcoin farming. But anyway, it just shows that linear programming is a very important concept and quite general and can be applied to different tasks. It basically goes back to Danzig, a researcher who died 2005. And the formulation is quite simple. So it's just about an optimization of a linear form, so of a linear scalar product, so to say, where you want to optimize for a vector x with respect to some values, cost values, so to say, and you want to minimize them. And the interesting part is that there are some boundary constraints which must be fulfilled for the solution vector you're looking for. And to get you an idea how this can be applied, I would like to start with a very simple example from, let's say, a business case, give a geometric interpretation of this kind of formulation here, and then we will switch over to graph optimization, graph matching, and max flow formulations for multi-people or multi-object tracking. So assume you have a small company and let's say you produce a cake and a muffin. These are your two products, A and B. To produce a cake A, you need 3 ingredients, C, D, and E. And these could be flour, sugar, and eggs. And for the muffin, you need maybe other ingredients, maybe say just flour and sugar. And you can sell a cake for 30 euros and a muffin for 20 euros. And you know you have only a limited amount of resources available for your flour, sugar, and eggs. So the question is, how much of the product A should you produce and how much of the product B to maximize your outcome? And this is your optimization task at the end. You want to maximize this scalar product. So you want to maximize the amount of A and the amount of B. And if you sell both of them, you want to maximize the reward you get. And these are the boundary constraints that if you sum up the amounts of X1 and X2, it must be smaller than 1,500. For the second ingredient, smaller than 1,200, and for the last ingredient, less than 500. So these are boundary conditions which must be fulfilled. And this can be also geometrically interpreted because we are just solving for 2 unknowns here, X1 and X2. You can arrange these unknowns as a line here in the space with such a slope going through the origin. And you want to basically find a maximum or an optimal point on this line. You can also see here the boundary condition. So this is the boundary condition of the third ingredient, which must be less than 500. And here you have the other boundary conditions for the products you have, which give you some lines. And the solution space, which is valid, is the interior of a polygon or a polytope if you move to ND. And then the optimal point for the solution is this outer point here, which projects here to the maximum point along your line. This is the solution you're looking for, such an edge of such a polygon, and this can be solved numerical using the simplex algorithm introduced by Danzig. And the nice thing is that the main challenge is how to formulate all these equations. And if you use MATLAB, R, or Python, these just a few lines, and then you get, like as a miracle, the solution of how much you should produce of A and B, and what is the overall outcome for these two products. So this is just a starting example on to get used to this kinds of optimization formulations of optimizing a linear function together with some boundary constraints or linear boundary constraints which must be fulfilled. The formulation is, as I said, quite powerful, and there are many examples what you can do with this. You can do the resource optimization, as I have mentioned, but you can also do logic inference. You can do graph-based optimization, computing graph cards, max flow, graph matching, and these things. But it's also applied to integer problems like solving the traveling salesman problems or solving Sudoku puzzles for your grandparents, whatever you like. And you can also make a relation how to model, for instance, support vector machines as a linear program, and how to optimize the decision boundaries there. And you can also optimize decision trees in a global optimal way using such an approach. So it's, as I said, very, very useful. So it's really worth to dive into these concepts of linear programming and then how to make use of it for our applications in medicine, but also in other tasks like surveillance or tracking beats in tissue. So what does graph matching mean? Graph matching means that you have two sets, like these three particles here. You want to find a best assignment between these two sets, and you simply compute the distances from each point from one set to each point to another set. This is basically a bipartite graph where you have two subsets and only edges across these subsets of nodes. You have these distance values here, which gives the measurement what is the distance between, let's say, this point to this point. If this is here A, for instance, these distances here. And now you want to optimize the assignment, which means you're looking up for a special matrix which has the property that each point here is assigned to at most one point here and vice versa, which means you want something like 0 and 1 entries here, where in each row and each column you have up to one entry with a value of 1. And this is then the optimization problem. You can simply stack this as a kind of vector under these boundary conditions where you enforce that the rows and columns must be less than 1 if you select this vector f here. This is the formulation of the optimization problem. You can place this or formulate this and optimize this using linear programming. And one interesting property for such a graph matching task here is that the conditions you have here are so-called totally unimodular, which means you can take any square-sized submatrix, and the determinant of this submatrix is either 1, -1, or 0. And this means the linear program already gives you an integer solution. This is not in general the case. And that's why there are also modifications out based on this simplex algorithm. And one modification is called branch and bound, which means you solve a standard linear program, and then you integrate integer constraints, and you generate something like a decision tree for non-integer solutions, and this allows you basically to generate such a tree. Later on, you can cut off some of these branches and also optimize for plain integer values, which is sometimes quite important, because sometimes we don't want something like intermediate solution, but real assignment decisions. One example to do this is for the traveling salesman problem. So the traveling salesman problem means you have a couple of nodes and you want to find the best path which meets all the points, so that the path is as short as possible for you, because the traveling salesman want to minimize the effort of traveling. And if you just formulate this as a matching problem, as a cycle problem you've seen before, there are degenerate solutions produced from the linear program or integer linear program, where basically the path is separated into subcircles. And then you can identify these subtours, and then you can express them as constraints, which should not be allowed. And then you can iterate this a couple of times, and finally you can solve this and eliminate our subtours, and you can optimize the traveling salesman problem quite efficiently, even though this is an NP-hard problem. It's formally still an NP-hard problem, because for the branch and bound, you have to generate a decision tree which can span exponentially wide. But since many branches are cut off quite efficiently, very often the computations are still feasible and still, at least for a good amount of points, as you can see here, computational possible. So how to do this for multi-object tracking? This example shows you a little bit how this adjacency matrix is generated if you have a couple of frames, and in each frame you have a couple of detections. So we have one detection here, in the second frame 2 detections, then we have 3 detections, and then 2 detections. And we basically generate such a graph which allows you from one frame to another to connect these detections. And now you want to make the optimization in such a way that you're only allowing one children to be connected with one parent node. So the algorithm must decide which path to follow, and we want to minimize the distances here. So it's basically more likely that, for instance, 1 is connected to 2 than 1 is connected to 3. And if you want to connect 3 to 5 or 6, it's maybe more appropriate to connect 3 to 5 than 3 to 6, because the local distance is smaller. But you never know, there might be another connection following afterwards that makes me more useful to follow this global trajectory here with the lower detection. So that's why we're interested in this kind of global optimization and not just pathwise optimization for just for such a multi-object tracking framework, and this is also known as a max flow optimization. The flow formulation looks like this, that you have a virtual start and sync node, because you never know which people are entering and leaving the scenes, and then you're optimizing across these possible trajectories here. These are also called binary potentials, because you have pairwise potentials or forces across these detections. In people detection scenarios or object detection scenarios, you also have very often detection confidences, especially when you also have multiple detections on one object. And this is possible to be integrated as a unary potential, which is just a very small connection from the detection to itself, so to say. And then you have a more abstract formulation about how to bring together let's say the confidence measure of one detection together with the distance measure across these detections. We can also compute features for the detection boxes and compute some kind of similarity scores. And so you can basically mix up geometric and also feature information to indicate the edge cost you have here in this graph model. And this is here another visualization on how to make an abstraction of such a scene here as such a graph. In this case, you have one detection here, and these people are not detected, which is shown here for the first frame. Then you have 3 detections for the second frame and 2 detections for the third frame. And the optimization would give you a connection from B1 to E1 to B2 to E2 to B5 to E5, and then going down to the sink here, so that this path here is optimized. So this can be formulated with these weights as such an adjacency matrix and can be optimized using a linear program. And then you can apply this to different data sets, like here this multi-people tracking data set, which consists of around 800 frames. You can see all these trajectories of people, but you can also see that some of the trajectories are quite fragmented. And this is the balance between the in and outgoing costs and how much motion you allow across the frames. The challenges have grown more and more. So this is one image from a very recent challenge, the MOD20 data set, where we are also competing. And you'll see there are many people involved and these sequences are very long. So the graphs you try to optimize are really huge. And this is one of the reasons why we are also investigating approximate solutions for the max flow problems and why we are investigating more abstract formulations using lifted edges, for instance, to enforce consistency across multiple frames simultaneously. One other challenge more from medicine is cell tracking. And this is one simulation here for cell tracking, just showing about what we are interested in. So we have a system where we have 3 cells here. And then these cells here are growing over time. They are also allowed to move over time, and then they can replicate over time. And this is basically visualized here. It looks a little bit like small bubbles, which are exploding to smaller ones. And you can see they are growing faster and faster. And we are basically now applying this model and also such a linear program formulation to find the best, so to say, tree on how these cells have emerged. So here you can see in the lower part, the starting situation of these 3 cells with the center point at the position, and then they are moving, then they are replicating. And you can see that we have here these 3 colored main branches. And this allows you to identify how much one cell has replicated, what kind of interaction happened to other cells. And if you have different areas in your sample, for instance, with some kind of medication involved, you can also see the effect of, for instance, antibiotics to some parts of the cells. And so this is basically what we are working on to identify the replication rate and the effect of specific cells. This is an example sequence from the cell tracking challenge, where you can also see how the cells are replicating. This is a very small data set, but you can see that image contrast is not so good. And also the detections are sometimes a little bit fuzzy, what really happens there. But yeah, you can see it's possible also to generate these kinds of replication trees here. And this is another example, which is a little bit larger, where you can also see how the cells are moving and replicating. Some seem to be washed away. I don't know why and for what reason, but they are growing more and more. And you can imagine that there are many cells involved over time, and it's getting harder and harder to keep track of them. And these are, this is, for instance, one example how this can be established. So here we also tracked these cells simultaneously, and were able to identify, so to say, the mother cell and all the children cells afterwards. So what are the current challenges we are still facing? So we are basically dealing with the challenges of how to make missing, how to deal with missing cells, inconsistent cells, and multiple detections. So many algorithms we have the problem that we have multiple detections of one cell. They are partly overlapping. We have these contrast changes. So also neural network-based detection approaches sometimes fail. We have the situation that across the frames, if one cell is missing, it can reappear again. So we have to link across multiple frames, and we are dealing with the challenge of re-identification of objects. This can be quite simple if you consider, for instance, traffic scenarios with different colored cars. But this can also be quite complex if you consider sporting situations where people are wearing very similar sports dresses or t-shirts, just with different numbers on their back. So we follow here also different approaches, also using different sensor technologies like IMU sensors, for instance, to allow for better re-identification, and or also how to merge multiple detections of faces together with body detections and bring this together. And we are working on multi-view consistent tracking, which is also an uplift of the complexity of such a graph model, when you not just have an image video over time, but you have many videos simultaneously over time. So they must fulfill also, for instance, the epipolar consistency or epipolar constraints, so that you get a consistent tracking across all frames in all, or across all cameras and all frames. And as I said, these graphs are getting more and more complex, and that's why we're working on approximative solvers. This was a cooperation with the Max Planck Institute in Saarbrücken. We published at ICML last year. And yeah, but we are also working on other approaches, how to optimize such, yeah, let's say multi-object trajectories in a global fashion. So maybe I should also bring this into a context that we are only dealing with a global optimization task here, which means we have the sequence completely given and we optimize for that. And it's different to a filtering approach where you have an online tracking system and want to follow, let's say, objects, for instance, in real time, given a fixed time instance, which is maybe more important for driver assistance, where you want to make a prediction for the next frame. So these are filtering approaches where you can apply particle filters and Kalman filters. Here we are only talking about a global optimization of a given sequence, like a biological probe or sample from the cell data. We are frequently participating in these benchmarks, and you are also welcome to look up the MOT challenges or the cell tracking challenges. It's basically some kind of competition, which is quite nice because other people are participating. You can see what kind of ideas they have to make the scores better. So over the last 8 years, I think we have been placed first time for 4 or 5 times, and then we got pushed back to the second and third place. So we came up with other ideas and so on. So it's quite active field on the research, and there really happens a lot on all different parts, which is the detection part, which is the formulation of the graph network, which is also the optimization of such graphs. And it's getting, simply speaking, more and more complex, but we also have now much better tools in place to really able to solve these things. These were 2 of the awards we received in the last years. And as I said, we are still competing there. And currently our lift-based trackers also placed 1 at the moment. But we have CVPR coming up and ICCV reviews soon. So I think we will be pushed back to the 2nd place again. So yes, with that, I'm more or less finished with what I wanted to say. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm open to questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Bodo. Maybe we'll put down the slides, and whoever wants to talk puts on the video. Any questions, comments on the presentation?
I just remind the attendees that they can raise their hands if they have any questions, and I can unmute them.
In the meantime, maybe I'll start with one question that I found it quite interesting, right, that you in one part of the talk focused on linear programming, right, which is a really nice technique. Can you elaborate maybe a bit more how you would choose in a specific scenario, whether you use this more global optimization approach, or let's say where you want to go to a kind of incremental optimization using machine learning, maybe neural networks? Could there be a criteria which?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think when you have settings where what you would like to formulate is differentiable, it's quite useful to go to such a framework like your networks, where you can apply auto differentiation and these things and then optimize for that. But you must be aware that even though many techniques are quite sophisticated now, using ADAM, SGG, and all these solvers, or using dropouts, so that you're not so likely to get stuck in local minima, it's still a gradient descent-based approach. So you must be aware that you're always getting some kind of local minima, which might be quite close to the global one, but you have never proved that you have found the global optimal solution. And there are some settings that's really important to find really the global optimal solution, and this is where this setting is useful for. And another interesting part of this optimization technique is it allows you to optimize non-differentiable functions. So if you have a task like these integer constraints you would like to have fulfilled, you can try to approximate them. This is more or less what the sigmoid function in a neural network is doing. At the end, in the original formulation, you wanted a step function, but this is not differentiable, and that's why people came up with a sigmoid function, because this is what you can optimize for. And this is also some kind of price to pay then. So if you really have non-differentiable optimization functions, and this is also what you have in logic optimization, for instance, I think this can be a very powerful framework, because many of these tasks are automatically NP hard, but still they can be efficiently solved with these branch and bound and branch and cut strategies. So this is more or less what I would look at if I have a specific problem. What kind of properties does this problem fulfill? And if it's really useful then to apply this global optimization technique there.
Okay, thank you very much. Additional questions, comments?
And maybe as a side remark, this is still machine learning because you can publish at ICML there. So.
Right. Not everything has to be neural networks. It's refreshing to have different approaches, indeed. Yes, Mega?
So just a follow-up question from what Wolfgang started. So there are new techniques coming up, for example, for graph-based combinatorial problems using machine learning via reinforcement learning, via this feedback loop. There have been some approaches for let's say, traveling salesman problem, but again, they are not as good as these classical algorithms. But one advantage there could be that you can train your neural network and reuse that trained network again and again without running the heuristic several times, right? So that could give you one advantage, but I mean, what do you think in these problems? Would that advantage be good enough, useful enough to compromise for the I don't know, for the accuracy of the result? So they might be suboptimal. I mean, of course, it's NP hard. All problems are suboptimal, but they might be very close to heuristics, but heuristics might still be beating them. But this advantage that you can reuse your neural network, you can use your trained function to with just one forward pass, you get your answers very quickly. Is that an advantage could that be a motivation to try out these neural network based approaches for combinatorial problems like these?
Yeah, so one comment is you can also train, let's say, optimization parameters in an iterative way using linear programming, and you can use old solutions as some kind of boundary constraints and then continue optimization for that. So this is not really a contradiction. You can also use this on subsets and use this to initialize neural networks and then follow up training there for some kind of warm start, so to say, which I've also already seen. And regarding the power, I think there are many advantages in neural networks. They can parallelize things. You have efficient GPU programming, and it really can handle a huge amount of data. And these are all issues which are quite problematic in linear programming because these constraint matrices are really exploding after a while. So there are definitely some limitations, and I don't think it's like let's say an alternative to neural networks, but I think it's just the second view we can have to specific problems using this, and it's definitely worth to play around with it and then to learn this from this for the, let's say, differential frameworks we might apply afterwards.
Thank you.
Very good. There's another question by Harsh. Harsh, do you want to turn on your video and unmute yourself?
Thanks for giving the opportunity. Unfortunately, I can't switch on my video. I'm from the desktop. So the discussion about how efficient the algorithm would be is really like we can't reach to a good end in that discussion. But however, what I can do is I can ask you a question on how this imaging has been successful, because there might be false positives and false negatives in this case. Like there might not be a cell which is dividing, but there might be an artifact which might catch that the cell is dividing, and we can get a result on that. And on the other hand, it can be the other way around. There might be a cell dividing, but the camera or the imaging technology might not catch that up. So is there any error analysis which you are doing at the back before getting the optimization process being done?
Yeah, so that's definitely true. So you can have still many errors and many error types involved. There are different strategies to deal with that. One is to do some kind of post-processing afterwards, to split up something like tracklets and to compute some kind of confidence measures for this, and then to reanalyze further on. And there's also quite some effort in how to model these edge weights. And these edge weights are, for instance, driven from these geometric features like the connectivity or how close detections are to each other, but also about the content you have in these bounding boxes. So you derive some kind of features like these re-identification features. You could also use simple statistics like Hawk features or histograms or whatever. But there's quite some effort on how to find appropriate weight measures to get the right graph optimizing for the right thing, so to say. And this is definitely one of the wheels you have to control to get good results. So the simpler way would be something like post-processing, and then you try to learn from that to make the weights of the model better so that the global solution is more appropriate.
Yeah, a quick follow-up suggestion or a question probably. Can we use like fractal geometry to model the way in which the cells divide in this case?
Fractal geometry, I would say to some extent, because we have many biological structures which behave like this. So I haven't integrated this as some kind of special prior so far, but in interpreting a fractal as something like, let's say, a text or term replacement system, it should be possible to also integrate this as an LP. So I think, yeah, it's definitely possible. That's an interesting suggestion.
Very good. Any additional questions or comments? If not, thank you, Bodo, first for the very interesting presentation. Thank you, everybody, for the good discussions which again, of course, leads to new additional suggestions and insights. And we'll continue with the next talk.